But when you met him as a young girl, I mean, do you remember any of the things he said to you, any of the advice he gave you?
Some of them. You want me?
Please.
Yes. Well, I do remember one occasion. He was very interested in what we did in the little corps, that you might call it a little church, the group to which we belonged, you see. So if he was at home, it was important to tell him how it had been on Sunday. Well, how did you get on? And was there anyone at the penitent form? And did you do anything? And I said that day, yes, Grandpa, I can see the room, you know, and him and myself. I sang a solo. Oh, we said, how did you get on? Well, I said, well, I did my best. And then he suddenly seemed to be angry with me. He roared at me, and he could, you know, he could shout. There were no such things as these, where are they, by the by?
The microphones?
Yes.
They're up there,
oh,
Commissioner.
Well, I see. Well, I needn't bother about them.
No, you mustn't bother about things like that.
But we had to learn to shout
yes.
in the army. And he had a splendid voice. And when he got onto the platform, you know, and he held himself up and shouted. Well, he shouted at me that day. You see, and I was all in a shiver. And he said, "Your best? What's the good of that, Catherine? You'll never be any good to me in the army if that's all you can do." Well, I felt dreadful. And then he suddenly stopped and changed. He said, "You see, dear child, when we believe in God and God helps us, we can do better than our best." And then he opened up all that idea of God being within reach and understanding how we felt.
William Booth's father built houses in Nottingham, England, for the children of the Industrial Revolution. Samuel Booth lived to make money. When in 1843 his business collapsed, it was the end of his world. Within months, Samuel was dead. 13-year-old William Booth had to leave school when the business failed. So now, he commenced what was really an education in poverty. His main schoolroom was the pawn shop where he'd taken work.
Pawnbroking business in England in that day was a very, very difficult business, because pawnbroking was people brought in their goods from their home and sold their goods to have a little bit of money to put bread on the table. And he knew, too, that many people were coming in and selling a little bit of what they had in their home, or pawning off a little bit of what they had in their home, not in order to put bread on the table for the children, but in order to buy more alcohol for that evening.
West of Nottingham, in rural Derbyshire, sits the town of Ashbourne. There, in this house, Cathrine Mumford was born. From a young age, she displayed an unusually intense nature. When she was 9 years old, she saw a drunk being hauled to the police station, taunted by a mob. She was unwilling to let him walk alone, to be humiliated, so she ran and walked beside him.
She suffered from a number of different illnesses. It's hard to know in modern terms what we would call those things, but she had a curvature of her spine, which she suffered with her whole life, and she was sometimes bedridden for long periods of time. So she read a lot. She read Methodist magazines and other religious works by a number of leading Methodist theologians. She was reading them at a very young age. She read the Bible every day. By the time she was 12, I think she'd read it cover to cover 8 times. And it made for a very quiet childhood, a very studious childhood, and often, I think, a very lonely one.
In the Booth household in Nottingham, William heard much less about the Bible and God.
However, there was a neighbor couple who had their eyes on William, and they began to take William to the Wesleyan Chapel.
In time, William became a Christian. The Wesleyan Chapel held 2,000 and was large enough to attract well-known revivalist preachers. One of them came for 6 weeks when William was 17. He was to mark William's life permanently. This was James Corhi. American, tall and thin, Corhi took the platform wearing a dark cape. People said his voice was like a ringing bell. Following one of his meetings, William went to this room and resolved that God would have all there was of him. When a young friend named Will Sanson persuaded William to join him in a mission to Nottingham's poorest district, William had stepped into his natural space. They began to visit the sick. After visiting, they would take a chair outside and stand on it to preach.
There's a lovely story in Nottingham of he and Will Sansom finding a beggar woman on the streets. And they took this beggar woman and they found lodging for her and provided food for her.
Within himself, William Booth began to feel he could do something large with his life. Yet his prospects were poor.
In 1849, William left Nottingham and came to London, and he worked in the Walworth Road as an apprentice to a pawnbroker's shop, where he only had 1 day off a week and worked more than 12 hours a day.
Now, at the same time that William moved to London, there was a woman by the name of Cathrine Mumford living in Brixton with her parents. And a man by the name of Mr. Rabbits, a mutual friend of the Mumford family and someone who was helping to support William Booth financially in his lay preaching, introduced Cathrine Mumford and William Booth. And there began, by all accounts, one of the great love stories of the Victorian England period. By their own accounts, it was love at first sight.
When William was 22, Rabbits told him he ought to preach full-time. "There is no way for me," Booth answered. "Nobody wants me." But Rabbits opened doors. So William Booth left pawnbroking for good and became an evangelist. Frequently apart as he travelled, he and Cathrine wrote letters almost every day.
It's also during that time that we start to get a sense of the personality, I think, of Cathrine. Because, for example, in one of her letters to William, she kind of tells William how he should be preaching and how he should be spending his time and that he should be studying more.
Cathrine Booth was the thinker. She grew up in a home where she was self-educated or home-educated, and she read a lot of theology books. William was a doer. William was a doer all his life. William was an activist.
They were a perfect blend. Each had found a partner who could bring out their innate gifts. On June 16th of 1855, Cathrine Mumford and William Booth were married. 3 years later, the Reverend William Booth took charge of the Methodist New Connection Chapel in Gateshead, near Newcastle. Cathrine was struggling. She was pregnant with their third child. Her health was not strong, and she felt restless to give more in ministry. At their previous church, she had taken on a Bible class for women. But for women at that time, to go much further was not easy.
Women could preach, but only on an occasional basis. Only on a given Sunday they might stand to preach.
Remember, it would be many years before women would be able to vote. It would be many years before women would be able to enter Oxford or Cambridge.
In Gateshead, Cathrine discovered she could get alongside the families of heavy drinkers. So she began to visit them 2 nights a week.
I remember in one case finding a poor woman lying on a heap of rags. She had just given birth to twins, and there was nobody of any sort to look after her. I can never forget the desolation of that room. I was soon busy trying to make her a little more comfortable. The babies I washed in a broken pie dish. Cathrine Booth.
The Booths were keen on the American revivalist Charles Finney and the holiness teacher Phoebe Palmer. Both encouraged women to take public roles.
In 1859, Phoebe Palmer, who was an American holiness teacher and preacher, came to England. And it was a big event for Catherine. She was already well known to Catherine through her writing. It also occasioned a lot of debate in the English press because here was this American and a woman, and she's preaching. And a number of Methodist and Anglican and other periodicals, not religious necessarily, but all kinds of people commented on this, what was going on. And one of them was a man by the name of Arthur Augustus Rees, and he wrote a whole pamphlet denouncing Phoebe Palmer and saying it was unscriptural, that women were not to be doing this. This was wrong from every angle. This was wrong.
Phoebe Palmer happened to be very important to Catherine Booth, and so Catherine thought that it was her task to defend Phoebe Palmer. And in 1859, she wrote one of her most important writings. It was originally called Female Teaching. In a later edition, it was called Female Ministry, or Women's Right to Preach the Gospel.
It was published a few days before the birth of her fourth child, Emma.
And this was, again, something not very common for a woman to do, but she said to her mother, "I'm determined that fellow shall not go unthrashed." And she wrote a very carefully argued pamphlet about why women should be preaching. And in it, you really see her scriptural knowledge. This is a woman who read theology deeply and carefully and thought about it deeply. And she goes through all the biblical passages and she considers each one in turn.
However, she had not yet herself entered into ministry, and that's another story, because on Pentecost Sunday of 1860, when William Booth had finished his sermon on that Sunday morning in Gateshead, and he was about to pronounce the benediction, Catherine Booth stood up and came forward and said to her husband, "I want to say a word."
William came down from the rostrum. Catherine went up and gave her testimony and confessed to the people how she had allowed her timidity to hold her back and refrained from testifying the way she should do. And after she finished, William got back into the rostrum and said, "My dear wife will preach tonight."
And she did. And soon she began preaching regularly.
I went to Bethsaida last night to supply for William. I spoke for an hour and 5 minutes. I got on very well and had 3 sweet cases. I cannot tell you how I felt all day about it. I never felt in such a state in my life. I could neither eat nor sleep. I was pressed into it against my will, and when I saw the congregation, I felt almost like melting away. William, of course, is very pleased. If I had only time to study and write, I should not fear now.
William didn't last with the Methodist New Connection past the following year. They could not agree. He wanted to specialize in evangelism like Finney. They insisted he take a local chapel. The fact was, neither he nor Catherine were suited to working under other people's leadership. So with 4 children, they returned to the insecure life of the traveling evangelist.
It was a time of great struggle for them. And the reason was because many denominations, many churches, many local churches would not allow them to preach in their pulpits.
William learnt a great deal in that wilderness, but 4 years later, at nearly 36 years of age, he was in a sense still looking for his life's work. Early in 1865, an invitation came for Catherine to preach in London. Other invitations followed, so the family moved to the capital. It was the decisive move of their lives.
There were 2 Londons in William Booth's day. If you think of London in that time and begin at the west end of London, with the very wealthy in their beautiful homes and their parties and all of the servants that they had in their homes, living in the basement of those homes. And if you move to the middle of London and look at the financial district of London, at the actual city of London, and see the wealth concentrated in the financial district, a wealth which was really controlling a quarter of the world's economy. If you walked east from the Bank of England about a mile, you would have found another London.
The author Walter Besant wrote, 2 million people live in the East End of London. They have no public buildings to speak of. They have nothing. Probably there is no such spectacle in the whole world as that of this immense, neglected, forgotten, great city of East London. The East End drew William Booth like a magnet. On the morning of the 26th of July, 1865, Booth was walking in the East End district of Whitechapel. Across the street from the Blind Beggar Hotel, he met an Irish boxer named Peter Monk. "I looked at him," said Monk. "He looked at me. Something of the man's exterior appearance took hold of me then and there. I could see he was a minister. But after he'd looked at me a long while, says he very sadly, 'I'm looking for work.' I was taken back. I got hold of some coins in my pocket and was about to give them to him when he pointed to the boys outside the public house. A great crowd of them, and says he, 'Look at those men, forgotten by God and man. Why should I be looking for work? There's my work, over there, looking for me.' He told me he was preaching in the Mile End Road and asked me to come and hear him." A few nights later, William Booth began the 8-mile walk home. As he walked, he passed ragged, neglected children in the street, beggars hoping for a coin, prostitutes looking for work. He seemed to hear a voice saying, "Where can you go and find heathen such as these? And where is there so great a need for your labours?" As he walked, Booth dedicated himself, Cathrine, and their children to God. He resolved, "These people shall be our people, and they shall have our God for their God." William arrived home between 11 and 12 and found Cathrine waiting. He said to her, "Kate, I have found my destiny."
When my grandfather was 12 or 13, William took him out one evening to the East End of London where he was working, and took him into some of the public houses that lined the roads. They came in and found the people were there, many of them drunken. Women were with their little babies, and the situation was really very sad. Of course, these men were out of work, they were poor, they were uneducated, and in desperate need. And as they looked at them, William turned to Bramwell, William Bramwell his name was, and he said, "Willie, these are our people. These are the people I want you to live for and to bring to Christ."
They were not easy people to reach. The East End was hard soil for Christian sowing. Already numerous Christian missions and charities operated there, and none of them found the going easy. Some of these missioners now teamed up with William Booth, and together they formed what at first they called the East London Christian Revival Union.
The major thrust of the mission was in the open air, right from the beginning. William Booth would hold these meetings for evangelism up and down Mile End Waste and in other areas in the East End of London. And then, of course, people became converted through his ministry and his message. And I'm sure that his original aim was to send them to the other churches. But for various reasons that wasn't working. And so he had to hire various premises in order to continue with teaching these people and also to hold evangelical services.
Many of the poor wouldn't step inside a church, so Booth hired secular buildings, such as this dance hall. In February 1867, they commenced meetings in the Effingham Theatre. It was said to be one of the dingiest and gloomiest places of amusement in all London. But it held 3,000, and that suited William Booth just fine. A journalist named Kirkham went to an afternoon meeting and found 500 gathered. No less than 43 people stood up to tell their personal stories. An African named Burton said that week he held his first open-air meeting in one of the roughest parts of London. And when the people saw him kneel in the gutter and pray for them, they thought he was mad. But he was glad to be serving. In 1871, William Booth published a slim volume entitled How to Reach the Masses with the Gospel. A 24-year-old Methodist named George Scott Railton read it. At the age of 19, Railton had travelled to Morocco to preach to the Muslim population. Impetuous and brilliant, Railton was now living in England, and he went to London to see Booth's work for himself.
He was very much moved by the ministry of William and Cathrine Booth, and he knew that he wanted to join the Christian mission. William and Cathrine Booth invited him to live in their home for a few weeks so that he could find an apartment there in London as his headquarters. And as the story goes, 11 years later, George Scott Railton moved out.
At 15 years of age, Bramwell Booth was appointed Treasurer of the Preachers' Benevolent Fund. As he grew older, he gradually became William's right-hand man. When just 6 years old, Elijah Cadman commenced work as a chimney sweep.
He was boarded out with a man who was a master sweep, who would have had several of these youngsters, kept deliberately thin and small in order that they could get up the chimneys. So that was his actual experience. But he seemed to survive very well. He was a fighter. He didn't grow very tall. He was always a small fellow and rather aggressive with it.
Cadman became a Christian through the working-class Primitive Methodist Church.
It was while he was working with the Primitive Methodists as a lay evangelist that he read something about the work of William Booth in the East End of London. So he got on a train without any more ado and went up to London to see for himself what was happening. And he describes that meeting with William Booth that day in the People's Mission Hall, and he says, "I dropped into the porch at Whitechapel and I dropped into my element."
In 1877, the Christian Mission, as they were now called, gathered for their annual conference. It would prove a turning point. When the Christian Mission began, it adopted a Methodist-style government of committees and annual conferences.
William Booth was getting very, very frustrated by the constant talking, and the fact that many people wanted to formulate rules about how things should be done rather than actually doing it. And he felt this had been a problem of many of the other organisations that were trying to do good work.
Needless to say, William and Cathrine Booth were not people who favoured committees. They were both quite autocratic by nature. As you come to 1877, some very important decisions were made. And the primarily important decision that was made was to have William Booth totally in charge of the Christian mission.
Railton welcomed the change. After all, he was already calling William General. The irrepressible Elijah Cadman was calling himself Captain Cadman.
I wrote out an advertising bill. It was just when people were half expecting to go to war. And I said, "War in Whitby. 2,000 men and women wanted to join the army." They thought it must be something wonderful when the women as well as the men had to fight. And I signed at the foot, Captain Cadman. So that's how I got my title.
Cadman was a shrewd judge of the public mind. Military language and ideas were in the air. The song Onward Christian Soldiers had been written just 13 years before.
It's a very militaristic age, and the volunteer army, the reserve army of the British Empire had been revamped, been put onto more professional lines. So people were talking about war and the probability of war.
When Railton drafted the mission's 1878 report, he wrote, "The Christian mission, under the superintendence of the Reverend William Booth, is a volunteer army." One morning, early in May, he showed the draft report to Bramwell and William.
And Bramwell said, "Here, I'm not a volunteer, I'm a regular soldier." And William took the pen in his hand, crossed off the word volunteer, and wrote in instead, "The Christian mission is a Salvation Army."
The other two sprang to their feet, and Bramwell said, "Thank God for that."
We had a general superintendent of the Christian mission, where they abbreviated that to the general, and we had Railton, who wrote to William and signed his letter, "Your obedient lieutenant." And so the ranks came in, and little by little the military structure of the Salvation Army developed.
Evangelists began wearing red jerseys with the Salvation Army emblazoned across the front.
To start with, it was a hodgepodge, but I think that reflected so much of what William Booth believed in, is actually to go out and do things. Let's try it.
In the 1880s, brass bands were very popular in England. A lot of trade unions had a brass band and workplaces had a brass band, so lots of people knew how to play brass instruments. It was quite a common pastime.
In Salisbury, the Salvation Army officer decided to use a local Methodist family to play their instruments to drown out the rowdies.
The Fry family were the first people to do this, and they found it very effective. If the rowdies started getting too loud, they'd just bring up their brass band instruments and start playing, and just bring up the tune and bring up the sound of the music, and that would just drown out the crowd. And they became very popular, and it became very much a part of the Salvation Army's appeal. And the brass band would stand on the corner, they'd do a testimony, they'd play some music, they'd sing some songs, and that would also just help to draw an audience.
William Booth was a man ahead of his time because he really appreciated the value of good publicity. He could have been a great PR man had he gone in a different direction. His credo was attract attention, and he told his soldiers and officers to do anything possible to get that attention. Booth really had a sense of marketing and of branding, and he made sure that people knew who the Army was, and the uniform was one of the ways to do this.
This metamorphosis from Christian mission to Salvation Army unleashed spectacular growth. In the next few years, thousands of people became Christians, and thousands joined the army, attracted from established churches. In 1877, the last year of its operation, the Christian mission was operating 31 mission stations.
From the 1878 through to 1883, more or less, a wave of expansion took place, moving first of all northwards towards the Yorkshire mining areas and the areas of northwest England where the factories were, and then southwest towards the mines of South Wales, to the extent that by the end of 1883 there were 427 Salvation Army Corps.
What you actually found between 1878, August 1878, and 1882 was in fact 3 new centres a week were being opened. Now that's phenomenal growth by anybody's standard.
Among the thousands of recruits, the army especially prized men and women whose lives had been radically transformed. William Booth told his officers, "When you go into a town, search for the worst alcoholic. Go after the woman at the end of her rope." He would rather his meetings were crowded with such people than with churchgoers. One of his mottos was, "Go for souls and go for the worst." And when the saddest soul was transformed, their neighbours took notice.
they were able to see it happen before their eyes, really. They saw the little homes transformed because the father of the household brought a joy to meet home on a Saturday night instead of spending all his money at the pub. And the children started to go to school because there was money. And all of those kind of things were vivid illustrations of what the grace of God could do.
It used to be starvation before they came. Now he brings his wages home to me instead of taking them to the public house.
If you want to know what God has done for me, go and ask my poor wife, whom I've beaten in my mad and fury until I've endangered her life and smashed everything I could lay my hands upon.
Some of these transformed people attained a kind of fame.
And there's Jane Johnson, who called herself the champion drunkard of the world. And when she would testify, she would talk about her years of drinking and bad living. Other people took names like the Hallelujah Midget.
You had things like the Bloodwash Collier, or the Happy Fishmonger.
Or Gypsy Smith. They were the flesh and blood proofs of salvation. In William Booth's eyes, people like Jane Johnson had been rescued by God. People without God were, he would say, like passengers on a ship, caught in a terrible storm. There they were on that ship, as waves crashed onto the deck, the rocks looming nearby, the sea raging. That is humanity without God, Booth would say, buffeted by forces beyond its power to resist, in terrible peril of judgment. That is you, poor sinner. But God loves the lost, he would go on. When Jesus Christ gave his life, he himself went under the waves of judgment on our behalf. He wants to rescue anybody, everyone. To Christian people, Booth would say, when a ship founders near the coast, the lifeboats rush out. People in nearby villages don't sit back and eat their supper, perhaps read a novel. Man, woman and child, they get involved. All around you on the stormy waters of life, people are perishing. Will you help them? Sin is a real thing, William Booth said. A damnable thing. It is sin that prevents the world being happy. He, along with leaders like Railton and Elijah Cadman, took the biblical view that sin, or wrong, came from inside a person. There was hope in some Christian circles that God could wash away this sin inside, that he could make a person truly good. The holiness movement and Phoebe Palmer believed it, and she influenced her fellow Wesleyans, the Booths. So the term often on their lips was holiness.
That is, that once you become a believer, that God has something more for you. That God has given you the promise that you can love him with your whole heart and mind and soul, and you can love your neighbor as yourself.
We teach that a man cannot be right with God while he is doing wrong to men. In short, decide that holiness means being saved from sin and filled with love to God and man.
God of Elijah, hear our cry. Send the fire. To make us fit to live or die, send the fire. To burn up every trace of sin, to bring the light and glory in. The revolution now begin. Send the fire.
So important was the message of holiness that in 1870, at the Conference of the Christian Mission, William Booth said, "Holiness is to us a fundamental truth. It stands to the forefront of our doctrines."
They wrote it on their banners and embedded it in their flag.
The first Salvation Army flag was presented in 1878 in Coventry Corps, And it was made up of a red background, a blue surround, and the yellow star. And Catherine often explained when she presented flags later on that the red stood for the blood of Jesus Christ, which purifies from sin. The blue stands for purity of holiness, and the fire of the star was the fire of the Holy Spirit, which actively leads his people.
But the flag and its people were encountering intense opposition. Frequently, crowds greeted army marches with abuse, hurled stones, rotten fruit, tin cans, and threw punches. During 1882, 669 Salvation Army soldiers were assaulted, 1/3 of them women, including 23 children. 60 buildings were seriously damaged.
There's always been a tradition in the United Kingdom of what's called rough musicking, and anything that's seen to be deviating from the norm has often been ridiculed and attacked. And I think out of that rough musicking tradition came some of the opposition to the Salvation Army. They set themselves up to be different. And so what better on a Friday night or a Saturday than to jeer at the Salvation Army?
In many cases, the ringleaders of these expeditions were known to the police and were encouraged by publicans and brewers.
So the publicans would give free booze, free drink to groups who would go out and attack the Salvation Army.
The authorities offered little protection. In many cases, they charged the Salvationists with disturbing the peace.
When they were charged and sent to jail, they had the option of a fine or, say, 10 days in jail, and you know what they always chose. They chose the 10 days in jail. And they would go to jail for the 10 days, and at the end of the 10 days, the Salvation Army Corps, the whole battalion, would line up, march to the jail, bring out the jailbird, and leave that jailbird dressed in the uniform of a jailbird, march them back to the citadel, and they would have a great meeting where the person would testify and talk about it and so on. And of course it got publicized in all the newspapers. All the newspapers loved it.
Booth's target was the common man, so meetings were very much in the revival style.
They were very participatory. People spontaneously started prayers, started songs, started singing, gave testimony.
And William Booth did not like the idea of one person standing up and doing all the talking while everyone else just sat and listened. They would make the whole service very lively and very energetic, and people were encouraged to clap their hands, they were encouraged to sing along, they were encouraged to move with the music. They were not meant to just sit and be very quiet and passive.
Both William and Catherine Booth preached usually for an hour to an hour and a half every time they preached. The preaching styles were a bit different. William Booth tended to roam on the platform and tended to move on the platform and so forth.
He was a very dramatic preacher, of course. You could see the people drowning. You could see the people reaching their hands above the waves.
Catherine Booth, on the other hand, had a very different style of preaching. Catherine tended to preach like a lawyer. Catherine tended to argue her point and make her point very clearly. In fact, the story goes that there was a gentleman who heard Catherine Booth preach, and at the end of the sermon he turned to his son, a future Archbishop of Canterbury, and he said to his son, "If I am ever in trouble with the law, don't get me a lawyer, get me that woman."
No matter who preached, every sermon climaxed with the altar call. The leader would invite people to walk forward to what Salvationists called the mercy seat, or the penitent form. Someone would pray, "Lord, come to us in your power.
See these lads perishing in their sins. Come, Lord, and save.
And the Spirit did come.
I heard a voice so gently calling, take up thy cross and follow me. A tempest on my heart was falling, a living cross it was to be. I struggled long, I struggled vainly, no other light my eyes could see. I follow thee, O light the giver. I follow thee, the great Redeemer. I follow thee, divine Deliverer. By thy grace I follow thee.
Adelaide Hayward was 15 years old when she began attending meetings in the East End.
Sunday morning she went to chapel. Sunday afternoon she went to her Methodist class. Sunday evening she sneaked down the Whitechapel Road and into the Salvation Army meeting, which was at the very first Salvation Army Corps. She was so excited because she said to her sister, I hear that after he's preached his sermon, the preacher goes round asking people if they're saved. Well, someone did that for her, and she got saved, age of 15. Now, you might have thought that she could be there for several years, growing up in the Corps, but not a bit of it. At the age of 16, she was actually commissioned as a Salvation Army officer. She was actually given a slip of paper which said, you are appointed a lieutenant and you go to open the work in Coventry. Coventry was a very rough area in those days. The army had a real hard time with physical violence and mobs and rioting. So imagine a 16-year-old girl from Methodist schoolroom one year and opening fire for the Salvation Army the next year at the age of 16.
Adelaide Hayward was not unusual. By far, the majority of the Army's officers, or full-time ministers, were very young. And at least half were women.
William Booth always said, you know, my best men are women. And in the 1880s, for example, almost 50% and sometimes more than 50% of the officers were women.
Women still did not have the right to vote, and most professions were closed to them. But Catherine Booth had opened a door, and thousands of young women walked through it.
William Booth had a rare genius for understanding the needs of young people. He also had this gift for being able to use people in a way that made them feel that they were in charge, they were responsible, they were challenged to do something really good for the kingdom of God.
Oftentimes the army would come into a small town and you'd read stories about young girls looking out their windows thinking, oh, if I could only run away with these folks. And the young women behind the window would be thinking, am I ready to trade in my beautiful clothes for that blue poke jacket and that bright red shirt? And eventually she probably would get up, leave her house, and go change her life by joining this religion of action.
There was a Salvation Army family by the name of the Shirley family who in 1879 went over to the United States. Their daughter was a captain in the Salvation Army. They decided that they were going to begin the work of the Salvation Army, albeit unofficially, in Philadelphia. So at 4th and Oxford, the Shirley family with Captain Eliza Shirley, just a young woman at the time, began to work as Salvationists and opened the work of the Salvation Army in the United States. However, this was not an official opening, and the Shirleys wrote back to William Booth and asked if William Booth would send reinforcements to help to establish the work of the Salvation Army in America. And so William Booth chose George Scott Railton and 7 young women for this task. And on March 10th of 1880, George Scott Railton and these 7 young women, these 7 Hallelujah lassies, walked down the gangplank of their ship to the base of the Manhattan, and they opened the work of the Salvation Army officially.
"11 months later, in February 1881, William Booth sent the army into France. To lead the expedition, he chose his eldest daughter, Cathrine. Now aged 22, Kate had been preaching since she was 13. She was bold and almost fearless. In September that same year, William Booth introduced a new recruit to his troops. He was 29-year-old Frederick St. George de la Tour Tucker. Tucker had been born in India and educated at an elite British boarding school.
And of course he was typical of the upper middle class who supplied most of the officers of the Raj in those days, the government of India. His grandfather had actually been the chairman of the East India Company.
At 22, Frederick sat in a crowded meeting in London and heard the American evangelist D.L. Moody. Moody introduced him to Jesus Christ. 6 years later, Frederick Tucker left his position as a magistrate in India and sailed for London.
And came to the founder and asked to be accepted as an officer. The founder said, oh, you belong to the dangerous classes and you should go out and see what we're like, first of all.
Tucker did, and before long was an officer. He felt the army could help the Indian people, and he persuaded William Booth to let him try.
When the 4 officers landed in Bombay, they'd already been announced as invading India, and the governor really took fright, and of course the police that were there to meet them far outnumbered this little quartet. And for at least for 6 months they were really harassed. They were called up before the magistrates, they were actually imprisoned, and the net result of all this, of course, was that they got tremendous publicity, and that helped to get them going.
Tucker spoke Indian languages and loved the country, so he was immediately at home. He took a lesson from Hudson Taylor and the China Inland Mission, who had adopted local clothing.
The founder had said to Tucker, get into their skins. And that meant, of course, going barefoot, wearing robes which were immediately recognized as religious mendicants. So they were absolutely recognized by the people instantly. And they carried initially begging bowls. They depended on the food that people put in. And this is all something which was fully understood, natural to India.
Tucker's sacrificial exploits became the stuff of legends. The army had a surprising impact, especially among the very poor. Sadly, Tucker's first wife died. When he remarried, it was to Emma Booth. The Booth family were very aware of their position at the apex of the movement. There was a charisma about them, and they had a prominence some resented, but they were extraordinarily gifted leaders. So Tucker became Frederick Booth Tucker. By the end of 1883, Booth's army was operating in 12 countries, and everywhere it fought an evangelistic war. "We are a salvation people," said Booth. "That is our speciality." Other groups, Christian and secular, were engaged on social work. Britain's Anglican Lord Shaftesbury, for example, had founded charities and introduced labour laws to get children out of factories. But Booth's approach was to help the poor by getting them saved, seeing their character change, and then work and family life would naturally improve. But he led an army of activists, and it was always possible that somewhere, someone among his ranks would lift a hand in organised social work. In 1883, it happened. Not in London, but 10,000 miles away, in Melbourne, Australia. A dishevelled man named Taylor approached Major James Barker. Taylor had spent all his life in and out of prison, and he pleaded with Barker to help him stay out of jail. Salvationists took him into their home. Taylor became a Christian, and soon after died, free. Barker was so moved, he decided to help other prisoners. So the army began to station officers at the prison gate. As men came out, the Salvationist would offer help with accommodation and legitimate work. Around the globe, the army now operated 1,000 local mission stations or corps, and one social service centre. A few months later, at Adelaide Hayward's East End Corps, a Salvationist named Elizabeth Cottrell counselled a young woman at the Mercy Seat. She learned that the woman was one of London's 8,000 prostitutes. Desperate to avoid sending her back to her lodging, Mrs. Cottrell took the woman home for the night. The next morning, Elizabeth Cottrell cleared 2 rooms in her basement and began inviting other women home. After 3 years, her husband Tom had had enough, so Elizabeth went to see Bramwell Booth, now the Army's Chief of Staff. He told her to find a house the Army could rent. She found a place in Hanbury Street, Whitechapel. His young wife, Florence, a veteran of the opening in France, became the shelter's manager.
The social ministry of the Salvation Army usually did not begin at the instigation of William Booth. Social ministry began as officers and soldiers were working in their own local situations with people, and as they had compassion for these people and wanted to aid them and assist them. And so, for example, in 1886, in Toronto, Canada, the Salvation Army opened up a home for alcoholic women. There again, not at the instigation of William Booth, but because there were local officers and soldiers in that situation who saw a need and they wanted to meet that need.
What Booth did was support these ventures with personnel and funds. He was an evangelist, yet he was intensely practical, and so these practical steps pushed him to widen his thinking.
William Booth, unlike many of his contemporaries, was not particularly interested in the big issues of the day. He lived at a time when other religious leaders grappled with evolution, with higher criticism, with the realization that there were other world religions besides Christianity. None of this mattered to him. Booth only cared about saving people. He believed in a religion of action. He didn't believe in talk. The Army wasn't tremendously theological. The Army was a religion of action.
One evening, on a cold winter's night, William Booth was coming home over a bridge, possibly London Bridge, and realized that men were sleeping out in the cold underneath the bridge, finding what shelter they could. And when he first saw my grandfather, Bramwell, he said to him, "Bramwell, did you know that men were sleeping under the bridges in this weather?" And Bramwell answered, "Well, I thought everyone knew that, General." And William then said, "Bramwell, go and do something. Find a warehouse, put some mattresses on the floor, get a coke stove, and look after them a little bit. But mind, no coddling."
William and Cathrine Booth could not anticipate that this step into social work would quickly propel their army into a crisis in the national spotlight. It began with a woman named Rebecca Jarrett.
Rebecca, when she was very young, started going into what were called pleasure gardens, which were places people went to drink, and they would sit outside and play different board games and drink, and she would go there. And her mother was permitting this and encouraging it. And by the time she was about 14, she was working in prostitution. And this continued for many years, and she started to drink very heavily, and that started to break down her health. And finally, when she was 35, she wanted to make a change in her life. But at that time, almost no rescue organization would take a 35-year-old woman. She went to a Salvation Army meeting, and she was dressed in very gaudy, showy clothes with a big blue feather in her hat. And so the Salvation Army people immediately saw this was a woman in some distress, not one that they had seen before, and they went over and they spoke to her. And so they took her down to London to the Salvation Army's rescue home. And much later in life, when she was a very old lady, she wrote about this, and she said what she most remembered was coming into this warm kitchen and a Salvation Army woman standing up and saying, "Oh, here you are, my dear, I've been waiting for you."
Rebecca became a Christian. Catherine Booth took an interest in her, as did Florence. They were troubled by her story and by the stories of other women who'd been put onto the streets as young as 11.
When people think of Victorian society, in London particularly, you think of a society strongly based upon the principles of morality, of propriety and prudishness.
But underneath the veneer of respectability was a white slave trade, where girls were sold into prostitution, often by their own families. Certain middle and upper class men were notable users of this exploitation. It was viewed as safe practice. 3 times bills had been to Parliament to raise the age of consent, to make it a crime to abuse these girls. 3 times it was rejected. There was a strong and passionate campaign against this evil, led by Josephine Butler.
She also became close friends and an ally of Catherine Booth, and together they started rallies and public meetings.
In July 1884, Branwell Booth entered the fight. He contacted an editor and journalist named W.T. Stead. Stead conceived a plan where they would buy a girl to prove how easily it could be done. They approached Rebecca Jarrett.
And they asked her to go and to purchase a child, and that she's not to explain to the family what's happening, she's just to do it as if this were really, really going to happen. And she goes into a London neighborhood, and she has a friend who helps her make contact with a Mrs. Armstrong, and she offers Mrs. Armstrong £5, and she brings this young girl.
Stead published the story on the front page of his Pall Mall Gazette in an article entitled "The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon." The story ran for 5 days. Copies sold out in hours. Simultaneously, the Army's paper, The War Cry, carried the story to readership beyond London.
In total, they were able to gain enough signatures to present to government a 2.5-mile-long roll of signatures, and to do this they decided to arrange a huge spectacle, which was a massive procession involving 250 uniformed officers, a horse-drawn emblazoned carriage, and a marching brass band. Now, this was an audacious publicity stunt on the part of the Salvation Army, and was able to attract thousands of spectators who were, in awe and wonderment of what was in front of them.
Within weeks, Parliament raised the age of consent to 16. By now, sections of the press and the police were out for revenge. The girl's mother had gone to the police.
And the police, instead of seeing this as an opportunity to look at the problem of young girls in London, they charged the Salvation Army and Rebecca Jarrett with abducting a young girl without the consent of her father.
Amid tremendous publicity, Branwell Booth, W.T. Stead, Rebecca Jarrett and 3 others appeared in court. For Rebecca, the trial was a terrible ordeal.
She was a notorious woman, and the newspapers condemned her, and during the trial, when she was driving through the streets of London, People would come around the carriage and throw things at her and scream things at her, and it was terrible pressure for a woman who'd only 3 months earlier been living as an alcoholic.
Bramwell Booth was acquitted. W.T. Stead and Rebecca Jarrett went to prison. She for 3 months.
She was the one to spend 3 months in hard labor in a very cold cell. And the only people who really stuck by her were, not surprisingly, the Salvation Army. And Catherine Booth visited her in jail and wrote to her. And on the day that she was released, Florence Soper Booth and Catherine Booth and I believe Katie all come in a carriage, and they come to get Rebecca and they bring her home with them.
William Booth was very moved by the compassionate ministry of his officers and soldiers. And in 1889, he wrote one of his most important articles. That article was called Salvation for Both Worlds. William Booth says very clearly that he has to fight not only against the sin of this world, but he has to fight also against the prevailing evils of poverty and idleness and prostitution and alcoholism and so forth in this world.
Booth's thinking had developed. Now, he wrote, "What is the use of preaching the gospel to men whose whole attention is concentrated on a mad, desperate struggle to keep themselves alive?"
If these people are to believe in Jesus Christ, become the servants of God, and escape the miseries of the wrath to come, they must be helped out of their present social miseries.
For Booth, poverty had proven a stronger enemy than he anticipated. It was a soul destroyer. For all its efforts, the army had not reached as many of the very poor as it hoped. In October 1889, helped by his head of social work and W.T. Stead, Booth began writing a book. The first half would describe the lives of the poor. The second would lay out a plan to help them. William Booth was now committed to a massive project to assist the submerged 10th. As he wrote the book, William was facing the hardest ordeal of his life. In 1888, Catherine Booth had discovered she had cancer, and the next 2 years were a terrible struggle. She continued to write and preach as long as she could, but eventually the cancer's progress, with its enormous pain, confined her to bed. Finally, on October the 4th, 1890, Catherine Booth, in Salvation Army terminology, was promoted to glory. Thousands attended her funeral. Booth Tucker recalled one poor girl who came and said, "She cared for the likes of me." Booth had no time to quietly grieve. 3 days after Catherine's death, his book was finally published to a storm of controversy. On its first day alone, In Darkest England and the Way Out sold more than 10,000 copies. It quickly became an international bestseller. Critics lined up to attack the book. Booth's statistics were wrong, they said. He didn't credit other agencies with their good work. Probably a fair criticism. He was a childish idealist, an impossible dreamer. His social schemes would not work. And he was money-hungry. The famous agnostic, Professor Thomas Huxley, fired off 12 angry letters to the Times of London. Huxley detested Christianity and the army. In one letter, he said Booth's autocracy was like the Sicilian mafia. But still, the book sold, and support poured in. In the end, In Darkest England exposed the army's work to sections of the public which had little interest in its spiritual activities. Around the globe, the army now consolidated and expanded its social work. In San Francisco for Christmas 1891, energetic soldier Joseph McPhee borrowed a large crab pot and hung it from a tripod on a busy street, posting a sign, Fill the pot for the poor. Free dinner on Christmas Day. He collected enough to feed 1,000 hungry citizens. Slowly, the army began to gain the public's trust. Now into his 60s, William Booth was often lonely, frequently ill, many times demanding. It was said he looked like a prophet, roared like a lion, acted like a general. William now handed much of the day-to-day running of the army to Bramwell. Together they refined the structure for this army, which stretched from New Zealand and Argentina and South Africa in the south, north through Sri Lanka and Jamaica, up to Sweden and Canada in the north. Returning to his first love, William began to travel the globe, preaching the gospel.
There's a story of him sitting on a railway carriage with Cecil Rhodes, the great South African colossus, the great imperialist. And he says to Cecil Rhodes, how's your soul? And Rhodes says, not very well. William Booth puts his hand on his shoulders, bends him over, get on the floor of the carriage and the train, and prays with him. And he would pray with everybody. He would ask everybody, how's your soul? Are you saved?
Visiting a city, Booth would tell audiences about the army's work. One story his grandson Wycliffe heard more than once. It concerned a man who had been in and out of prison again and again because of the drink. This man became a Christian, and an army officer helped him find work.
And then he came to the major and said, you know, I didn't come clean, I didn't tell you. I'm married, I've got a wife somewhere, don't know where she is, 3 children. Oh, Major, I'd like to be reunited with her.
The officer got the Army's Missing Persons Bureau in action, and they found the wife living on the east coast of England with the children. When he heard this, the man begged the officer to send her a telegram.
So the Major said, well, why not for once? We found your husband, doing well, got converted, holding down good job, wants to be reunited with you. And in a few hours the reply came back. If you found him, you can keep him.
By the early years of the 20th century, the name William Booth was recognised around the world. In London, at a ceremony in the Guildhall, he was given the freedom of the City of London. Nottingham gave him the same honour. On a remarkable day, Oxford University awarded Booth an honorary doctorate. The same day Mark Twain and the sculptor Rodin received doctorates as well. But Booth was still the evangelist.
Even William Booth himself in his later years often wondered, how is it that he, reared in poverty in Nottingham, coming to London without knowing literally a soul in London, how is it that he was honored in such a way? And he gave God the glory for all of the work that God had done through his life and through his ministry. When he was in the presence of the king, he was asked to sign a guest book. And on that guest book, he wrote this: some men's ambition is gold. Some men's ambition is fame. My ambition is the souls of men.
It was the army's practice to gather for large meetings. In Britain, these were sometimes held in London's Royal Albert Hall. Into his 80s, William Booth would still preach. At one of his last meetings, the old soldier gave his final call to battle.
While women weep, as they do now, I'll fight. While children go hungry, as they do now, I'll fight. While men go to prison, in and out, as they do now, I'll fight. While there is a drunkard left, while there is a poor lost girl upon the streets, while there remains one dark soul without the light of God, I'll fight to the very end.
At the age of 83, on August the 20th, 1912, the old general was promoted to glory. The army announced, the general has laid down his sword. A few days later, the funeral procession marched through the streets of London. William Booth's body was carried on a cortege, drawn by horses. Family members and friends and companions marched beside the cortege and behind it. Literally thousands of Salvationists marched behind the procession of their leader. And pressing the crowds in London at that time were hundreds of thousands of people. It was one of the last and one of the greatest funerals of the Victorian era. A very public funeral for a very public person.
The Christian mission we now will sing, glory, hallelujah, to the honor of our Lord and King, sing glory, hallelujah, hallelujah, glory, hallelujah, hallelujah, glory, hallelujah, hallelujah, to the Lamb, sing glory, hallelujah. In the east of London the work began, glory, hallelujah. Then far and near like fire it ran, sing glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, to the Lamb, sing glory, hallelujah. First in the streets, then in a tent, glory, hallelujah. With the word of life to the crowds it went, sing glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, to the Lamb, sing glory, hallelujah. And then we got a dancing room, glory, hallelujah, where hearts soon dance to a heavenly tune, sing glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, glory, hallelujah.